Barron Trump stepped into the prestigious university's calculus lecture hall, his presence initially unnoticed among the sea of eager students. They were there to learn, immersed in the rigor of mathematics, but none of them anticipated that this particular class would turn into something far more than a routine lesson. Barron had arrived merely as an observer, invited as a guest to sit in on the lecture. However, Dr. Williams, the calculus professor known for his strong ideological leanings, saw this as an opportunity he simply could not pass up. Dr. Williams had a well-established reputation for his skepticism toward the wealthy elite, particularly the Trump family. He was vocal about his belief that figures like Barron had been born into privilege, handed success rather than earning it. In his eyes, wealth was a byproduct of circumstance, not intelligence or merit. So, when he noticed Barron quietly taking a seat at the back of the room, a smirk crept across his face. This, he thought, was a golden opportunity to expose Barron, not as the well-groomed heir to a legacy, but as just another ordinary student, stripped of the grandeur of his name. The professor cleared his throat and strode confidently toward the front of the room. His voice carried an air of amusement as he addressed the students. Today, class, we're going to tackle some of the most advanced and challenging calculus problems. And as luck would have it, we have a very special guest in our midst, someone who comes from a family known for their influence and power. So, why not put that to the test? Mr. Trump, would you care to demonstrate your prowess? A hushed silence fell over the lecture hall. Dozens of heads turned, all eyes fixed on Barron. Some students exchanged wide-eyed glances, astonished that their professor would openly challenge someone of his stature. Others murmured among themselves, eager to see how this unexpected confrontation would unfold. Would Barron rise to the occasion, or was he about to be thoroughly embarrassed? Barron, however, remained composed. He offered a small, knowing smile and nodded slightly, an unspoken acceptance of the challenge. While the students whispered their speculations, his demeanor remained unshaken, as if he had already anticipated such an ambush. Dr. Williams, his confidence unwavering, turned to the board and began scrawling a series of equations. These were not the standard problems one would find in a typical undergraduate calculus course. They were deliberately intricate, designed to test the limits of even the most advanced minds. The professor stepped back, arms crossed, his expression tinged with smugness. "Go ahead, Mr. Trump," he said, his tone laced with subtle condescension. "Show us what you've got." The anticipation in the room thickened. Barron stood up slowly, adjusting his sleeves as he made his way to the front of the room. Every student in the lecture hall watched intently, their curiosity piqued. Was he truly a mathematical prodigy, or had his reputation as an intelligent young man been overstated? Dr. Williams handed him a piece of chalk, confident that Barron would falter. The professor had spent years mastering this discipline, and he had carefully chosen this equation to be an insurmountable obstacle, one that, in his mind, would dismantle the illusion of Barron's intellect. Barron gazed at the equation, his expression unreadable. The room was so silent that the faint scratching of a pen against a notebook could be heard from the back. Seconds ticked by, and Dr. Williams, arms still crossed, waited expectantly. Surely, Barron would hesitate, struggle, or admit defeat. But then, something remarkable happened. Without hesitation, Barron began writing. The chalk moved swiftly, confidently, across the board. His strokes were precise, methodical, his mind processing the problem at a pace that left the students stunned. He navigated through the complexities of the equation with an ease that made it appear almost effortless. The symbols and numbers connected fluidly, forming a seamless solution right before their eyes. The murmurs in the room ceased, replaced by sheer disbelief. Even the most studious among them had expected Barron to at least pause, to stumble, to fumble through the steps. But no. He solved the problem as if it were second nature. Dr. Williams's smirk faded. His confident stance wavered slightly as he studied the board, processing what had just happened. He had set a trap, one designed to expose Barron's supposed intellectual shortcomings, yet instead, he had inadvertently showcased the very brilliance he sought to disprove. As Barron placed the chalk down and turned back toward the class, he met the professor's gaze with a composed, almost amused expression. There was no arrogance in his demeanor, just the quiet, undeniable confidence of a young man who had long been underestimated, yet had never needed validation. The students erupted into whispers once more, but this time, it was not out of skepticism, it was admiration. Dr. Williams, finding himself at a loss for words, cleared his throat and turned away. The lesson continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The class had not just witnessed a lesson in calculus, they had witnessed a lesson in humility. And as Barron Trump walked back to his seat, it became clear that brilliance speaks for itself. Most challenging calculus problems the professor had ever presented, and he had done it in front of an entire lecture hall full of students who had been expecting his failure. The silence in the room lingered, thick with disbelief. The students glanced at one another, some leaning in to whisper, others simply staring at the board where the solution stood in perfect clarity. Barron Trump placed the chalk down gently, stepping back, his face calm and composed, not triumphant, not smug, just quietly assured. Dr. Williams, however, was far from composed. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, his jaw tightened. He had spent years refining his craft, years dedicated to mastering the intricacies of mathematics, and yet here stood a young man who had effortlessly dismantled every one of his attempts to discredit him. It wasn't just Barron's intellect that unsettled him, it was his poise. No matter how many obstacles had been thrown in his path, Barron had not once wavered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Williams let out a sharp exhale. He straightened his posture, forcing an air of professionalism. "Well," he said, his voice lacking the usual authority he carried. "I must say, Mr. Trump, that was unexpected." A ripple of amusement spread through the students. They could hear the reluctant admiration in his words, even if he was fighting against it. Dr. Williams cleared his throat and turned back to the board, as if he were still searching for a flaw in Barron's work. But there was none. A hand shot up from the front row. A young woman, her brow furrowed in curiosity, spoke. "Excuse me, Mr. Trump, but how did you do that? This problem alone would take most of us hours to even attempt." Barron turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "I've always had a deep interest in mathematics," he admitted. "Even when I was younger, I would spend hours studying equations and exploring different ways to approach problems. Numbers don't care about politics, wealth, or reputation. They are absolute, objective. And if you understand their logic, they become almost predictable." The room fell silent again, but this time, it wasn't out of disbelief, it was out of admiration. The students had initially watched the unfolding scene with skepticism, many expecting Barron to crumble under pressure. But instead, they had witnessed something remarkable: raw intellect, unfazed by arrogance or prejudice. Dr. Williams' lips pressed into a thin line. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the students were no longer looking at Barron through the lens of his last name but through the undeniable proof of his ability. His plan to expose Barron as a fraud had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly. One of the students, a young man with glasses and a skeptical demeanor, finally spoke up. "Professor, does this mean we'll be seeing Barron in the advanced mathematics program?" Laughter rippled through the room, but Dr. Williams didn't respond. He simply turned back to his desk, tapping his fingers against the surface in contemplation. Barron, however, remained gracious. "I appreciate the challenge, Professor Williams," he said, his tone genuine. "Mathematics should always be about learning, about pushing ourselves beyond what we believe we are capable of. I didn't come here to prove anything, I just love the subject." For a moment, Dr. Williams said nothing. But then, something changed. His hardened expression softened just slightly. With a slow nod, he muttered, "Fair enough, Mr. Trump. Fair enough." The class ended shortly after, and as the students filtered out, many of them lingered near Barron, eager to ask questions, to discuss the problems, to engage with him not as a wealthy heir but as a peer, an equal. Even those who had entered the room that day with preconceived notions now saw him in a new light. As Barron collected his things, one of the last students to leave stopped by his side. "You know," he said, adjusting the strap of his backpack, "people are always going to underestimate you because of who you are. But after today, I don't think they'll make that mistake again." Barron smiled slightly. "Let them underestimate me," he replied. "That just makes it more satisfying when they realize the truth." And with that, he walked out of the lecture hall, leaving behind a room full of students who had just learned a lesson that had little to do with calculus, but everything to do with character. Understand the way the world works at a fundamental level. Calculus isn't just numbers and formulas, it's a language that describes reality. The students leaned in, their notebooks forgotten as they listened intently. Even those who had once found calculus daunting were now viewing it through a different lens. Barron Trump wasn't just solving equations, he was translating them into something meaningful, something that extended beyond the classroom and into the real world. Dr. Williams watched with crossed arms, his skepticism still visible, but even he couldn't ignore the shift in the room. The students weren't just entertained anymore. They were engaged, inspired even. Barron turned back to the board, pointing at the equation. "Take this problem, for example," he continued. "It might look intimidating, but at its core, it's just a way of measuring how fast something is changing. Imagine you're designing an aircraft wing. You need to understand how air flows over the surface, how tiny variations affect lift. That's calculus. Or let's say you're optimizing an algorithm for AI. You're using calculus to predict changes, to fine-tune learning models. It's not about numbers on a page. It's about shaping the future. A murmur spread through the class. Even students who had struggled with math before were seeing it differently now. One of them, a young man in the back row, raised his hand. So, you're saying calculus is everywhere? That it's not just, an academic thing? Barron nodded. Exactly. It's in everything. Music, economics, medicine, technology, even nature. The way planets move, the way populations grow, the way a virus spreads, calculus describes all of it. And once you understand that, math stops being something abstract. It becomes a tool, a superpower, even. The young man nodded slowly, deep in thought. The class wasn't just listening. They were starting to internalize it. Dr. Williams, still standing by the board, clenched his jaw. This wasn't what he had intended. He had wanted to expose Barron as someone who thrived on privilege, not intellect. But instead, Barron had taken control of the narrative, turning what was meant to be a moment of humiliation into an impromptu masterclass on the power of curiosity and knowledge. Determined not to lose the upper hand, the professor spoke up. That's an interesting perspective, Mr. Trump. But being able to solve equations and explain concepts doesn't make someone a true educator. Teaching requires patience, structure, a deep understanding of pedagogy. Do you believe you could truly teach this class if given the chance? A few students turned to Barron, wondering how he would respond. Would he back down? Deflect? Barron simply smiled. Teaching isn't about standing in front of a room and talking, he said. It's about making people care. If you can inspire curiosity, if you can make someone want to learn, the rest takes care of itself. Dr. Williams opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a student in the front row spoke up. Professor, with all due respect, I've learned more about calculus in the last 10 minutes than I have in weeks. Laughter rippled through the room, but there was no malice in it, just the realization that something unusual had happened that day. Dr. Williams' face tightened, but he forced a smile. Well, Mr. Trump, he said slowly. It seems you've made quite the impression. Barron shrugged. It's not about me. It's about the subject. If you see math as something living, something that explains the world, it stops being intimidating. It becomes exciting. The bell rang, signaling the end of the lecture. The students hesitated, some of them reluctant to leave, as if they wanted to ask more questions, to understand more. As Barron gathered his things, one student approached him. Hey, Barron, do you think you could recommend some books on this stuff? I never thought I'd be interested in calculus, but now I kind of want to learn more. Barron smiled. Absolutely, he said, jotting down a few titles. Start with these. And remember, it's not about being the best in the class. It's about being better than you were yesterday. As he walked toward the exit, Dr. Williams remained by the board, staring at the equations that had once been his weapon, but had instead become Barron's stage. For the first time in years, the professor found himself wondering, had he been teaching his students the wrong way all along? And as Barron stepped out of the lecture hall, he knew that today had been more than just a lesson in calculus. It had been a lesson in perspective, one that, perhaps, even the professor had needed to learn. By the end of the class, everyone in the room had gained something far greater than just a deeper understanding of calculus. They had gained a new perspective on learning itself. The energy in the lecture hall was unlike anything it had been before. The students, who had once viewed calculus as nothing more than a necessary hurdle in their education, now saw it as a key to unlocking the mysteries of the world. And at the center of it all stood Barron Trump, the young man they had underestimated, who had just delivered a lesson more impactful than any textbook ever could. Dr. Williams remained at the front of the room, his mind racing. He had spent years lecturing about mathematics, following rigid curricula, emphasizing structure and memorization. Yet here was Barron, effortlessly breaking through those barriers, making calculus feel alive, making it relevant. For the first time in years, the professor found himself questioning his own approach to teaching. Had he been so focused on proving a point that he had forgotten the true purpose of education? The students, meanwhile, were eager to continue the conversation. Mr. Trump, one of them called out, you said math and business are connected. Can you explain how? Like, in a way that actually makes sense to us? Barron smiled. Sure, think about a startup company. Let's say you're launching a new app. You need to understand how users engage with it, how growth happens over time, how revenue scales. What does that sound like? A student in the back hesitated, then said, a function? Exactly. Barron nodded. Business is full of mathematical relationships. Calculus helps predict how those relationships change over time. Want to optimize profits? Minimize costs? Model consumer behavior? That's all calculus. Even the algorithms that power social media, the ones deciding which posts you see, are built on mathematical models that rely on derivatives and rates of change. The students were stunned. They had never thought about it that way before. Another student raised a hand. What about AI and machine learning? Isn't that more about coding than math? Barron chuckled. Coding is just the tool. The real power behind AI comes from mathematical models, calculus, statistics, and linear algebra. When an AI learns to recognize faces, predict stock prices, or even drive a car, it's solving thousands of calculus problems in real time. The better the math, the smarter the AI. The student who had asked the question nodded slowly, clearly deep in thought. At this point, Dr. Williams sighed, rubbing his temples. The resistance in him was crumbling. He had been so sure of his preconceived notions, so determined to expose Barron as a fraud, that he had failed to see what was right in front of him, genuine brilliance. He cleared his throat and addressed the class. I have to admit, he began, his voice quieter than before. This was not the lesson I had planned for today. But perhaps, it was the lesson we all needed. The students turned toward him, surprised by his change in tone. Dr. Williams looked directly at Barron. Mr. Trump, you've challenged my assumptions today. And for that, I thank you. Teaching isn't just about delivering knowledge, it's about inspiring curiosity. And I can see now that you've done exactly that. A wave of murmurs spread across the room. They had never seen their professor, someone known for his rigid, often combative stance, admit to being wrong. Barron, ever gracious, simply nodded. Curiosity is what drives progress. If people stop asking questions, we stop moving forward. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but no one immediately got up. They sat there, still processing what had just happened, reluctant to break the spell. Slowly, the students began to gather their things, many of them lingering near Barron, eager to continue the discussion. Some asked for book recommendations, others wanted to know more about specific applications of calculus. As Barron made his way toward the door, Dr. Williams called after him. Mr. Trump. Barron turned. The professor hesitated for a moment, then extended his hand. I misjudged you. I won't make that mistake again. Barron shook his hand firmly. We all learn something new every day, Professor. With that, he stepped out of the lecture hall, leaving behind a classroom full of students who had just learned a lesson they would never forget, one that went beyond calculus, beyond business, beyond preconceived notions. They had learned that true intelligence isn't about status or titles. It's about curiosity, perseverance, and the ability to see the world through a different lens. And as Dr. Williams stood there, watching his students buzz with excitement, he realized that today, even he had been a student. To be intimidating, perhaps even detached, given his status. But instead, they had found him to be approachable, insightful, and deeply invested in their learning. His words had struck a chord, not just with the student who had asked the question, but with everyone in the room. Dr. Williams continued to observe from the back, feeling an unfamiliar sense of humility creeping in. He had spent years believing that academia was the sole domain of deep intellectual thought, that business figures like Elon Musk, Barron Trump, relied solely on strategy and luck rather than real intelligence. But today, he had witnessed something different. Barron hadn't just demonstrated his brilliance in mathematics, he had done something far more meaningful. He had connected with the students in a way that Dr. Williams himself had struggled to do. The student who had spoken looked down at her notebook, clearly still processing his response. After a brief moment, she looked up again. But what if I try and still don't get it? Barron nodded, understanding the underlying fear behind her question. Then you try again, he said simply. And again. Learning isn't about instant success, it's about persistence. You only fail when you stop trying. Every expert you admire was once a beginner who struggled. I've had ideas that didn't work. I've made mistakes. But the only way to improve is to keep going. The room remained silent, the weight of his words settling over them. For the first time, many of these students saw learning not as a competition or a test to pass, but as a process, a journey. The pressure to be perfect seemed to lessen, replaced by something more valuable, a drive to improve, to understand, to push past their own limitations. Another student, a young man with a hesitant expression, spoke up. Mr. Trump, do you ever feel like people don't take you seriously? I mean, with who you are? Do people assume things about you before they even know you? Barron chuckled, sensing the underlying meaning behind the question. All the time, he admitted. People assume they know who I am because of my last name. They make judgments before they even meet me. But here's the thing. You don't have to prove yourself to everyone. You just have to prove yourself to yourself. The world will always have opinions. The only one that truly matters is your own. Dr. Williams let out a slow breath, feeling a pang of recognition in Barron's words. Hadn't he done the very same thing? Hadn't he judged Barron before even giving him a chance? At that moment, the professor made a decision. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Trump," he said, his voice more measured, less rigid than before. "I have to admit, I was wrong about you." The class turned to look at him, surprised by the rare admission. Even Barron raised an eyebrow slightly, though he said nothing, allowing the professor to continue. "I walked into this classroom today believing that success in business had no place in academia. I assumed that intelligence could only be measured in one way. And I was prepared to dismiss you before you even had a chance to prove yourself. That was a mistake." The students watched, some with wide eyes, as Dr. Williams turned fully to face Barron. "You've reminded me today why I became a teacher in the first place. It wasn't to prove a point. It wasn't to assert my authority. It was to inspire. And today, I wasn't the one who did that. You were." A murmur spread through the class, a mix of astonishment and respect. They had never seen their professor, who was known for his unwavering confidence, admit fault so openly. Barron, however, remained composed. He extended a hand. "Thank you, Professor. That means a lot." Dr. Williams hesitated for only a moment before shaking Barron's hand firmly. The class erupted into quiet applause, not out of formality, but out of genuine appreciation for what had just unfolded before them. As the students finally began to pack up, many of them lingered, reluctant to leave. Some approached Barron, eager to continue their conversation. Others walked past Dr. Williams, exchanging glances that carried a newfound respect for their professor. Dr. Williams watched Barron one last time as he made his way toward the door. There was something undeniable about him, not just his intelligence, but his ability to inspire, to break through barriers, to challenge expectations. And in that moment, the professor realized something. This wasn't just a lesson about calculus. It was a lesson about humility, about growth, about the willingness to learn, from anyone, at any time. And as Barron Trump stepped out of the lecture hall, he left behind more than just a classroom full of students. He left behind a changed professor. A changed perspective. And perhaps, the beginning of something far greater than just one lesson. Dr. Williams stepped out into the empty hallway, his mind still replaying the events of the day. He had spent years in academia, convinced that true intelligence could only be measured through credentials, research papers, and the structured rigor of university education. But in just one afternoon, Barron Trump had shattered that belief, not with arrogance, not with status, but with quiet confidence and an undeniable ability to inspire. Intelligence, as Barron had demonstrated, was not about accumulating titles or prestige. It was about curiosity, adaptability, and the willingness to challenge what one thought they knew. As students exited the classroom, their conversations filled the halls. Some excitedly flipped through their notes, revisiting Barron's insights on calculus, while others animatedly discussed how mathematics now felt more alive than ever before. The energy was unmistakable. Dr. Williams found himself wondering how many of his past students had left his class feeling this inspired. Had he been so focused on asserting authority that he had forgotten the true purpose of education, to ignite curiosity and passion? When he reached his office, he sat down at his desk, staring at the stacks of research papers in front of him. These papers contained years of meticulous calculations and theories, but they now felt incomplete. They lacked the human element, the excitement that Barron had effortlessly brought into the classroom today. For the first time in years, Dr. Williams felt an urge to change. That evening, he opened his laptop and began reworking his course syllabus, reshaping the way he would teach. Barron's words echoed in his mind. Calculus is about change. And maybe education should be too. Instead of rigid formulas and tests, the course would focus on real-world applications, on asking better questions, on making students see math as something living rather than just numbers on a page. When the new semester began, students walked into his lecture hall expecting the same routine, dense equations, long derivations, and structured problem sets. But something was different. On the board, instead of a complex formula, Dr. Williams had written a single question. How does calculus shape the world? The students looked around, confused. One of them hesitantly raised a hand, asking if it was a trick question. Dr. Williams smiled and shook his head. No tricks. Just a different way of thinking. Before we dive into equations, I want you to tell me, where do you see calculus in the real world? At first, there was silence, but slowly, hands started to rise. Architecture, economics, medicine, technology, Each student began connecting calculus to fields they had never considered before. The realization hit them: math wasn't just an abstract concept. It was the foundation of everything. Over the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Students who had once struggled with calculus were now actively engaged, not just because they had to be, but because they wanted to be. They no longer saw math as a set of problems to be solved but as a tool for understanding the world around them. Months later, Dr. Williams received a letter from Barron Trump. It read, "Professor Williams, I heard from some of your students that your class is different now. That you're making math something they look forward to rather than something they endure. That's incredible. I wanted to say thank you. Not just for what you told me that day, but for being open to change. Most people, especially those in positions of authority, are too afraid to admit when they're wrong. But you did. And that takes real intelligence. Education is about more than facts. It's about shaping the way people think, the way they see the world. You're doing that now in a way that few professors do. And I have no doubt that years from now, your students will look back and realize that you were one of the best teachers they ever had. Keep asking the right questions. Barron." Dr. Williams placed the letter down, a small smile forming on his lips. For so long, he had believed that intelligence was about knowing more than others. But Barron had taught him a different truth. That true intelligence was about being willing to learn. That lesson had changed him more than any equation ever could. And as he stepped into his classroom that morning, greeted by students eager to learn, he knew one thing for certain: he would never teach the same way again. Because the best teachers weren't the ones who had all the answers. They were the ones who taught their students how to ask the right questions. One of the most profound lessons from this story is that true intelligence is not about having all the answers. It's about the willingness to learn, adapt, and grow. Dr. Williams, an experienced professor, initially believed that intelligence could only be measured by academic credentials and traditional expertise. However, his encounter with Barron Trump revealed that knowledge is not confined to the walls of a university. It is found in curiosity, experience, and the courage to ask the right questions. This lesson is particularly relevant in life, especially for those in later years. As we age, it's easy to become set in our ways, convinced that the world no longer has much to teach us. But the reality is that learning never stops. The most successful and fulfilled individuals are those who remain open to new ideas, who continue to seek knowledge, and who embrace change rather than resist it. Barron's humility and passion for learning serve as a reminder that wisdom is not about status, wealth, or past achievements. It's about continuous growth. Similarly, Dr. Williams' transformation highlights the importance of letting go of pride and embracing the possibility of being wrong. In doing so, he not only became a better teacher but also a better person. For older adults, this story is an encouragement to keep exploring, to remain engaged with the world, and to never stop questioning. Whether it's learning a new skill, understanding evolving technology, or simply having meaningful conversations with younger generations, the key to staying mentally and emotionally enriched lies in maintaining a spirit of curiosity and openness. The world is always changing, and the ability to learn and adapt is what keeps us truly alive.